I'm not a journalist and I'm not a political scientist. I'm also not a security expert. And I wrote to Robert a number of times clarifying that if you expect a security-related or a political science-related talk, you can get up and go.
Wait until Tuesday.
Okay, we'll wait here until Tuesday.
So you can stay here.
Right.
You can stay
right.
upstairs.
What I am, and I should explain how I began to study the Self-Defense Forces, is I'm an anthropologist by training. And I did a number of research projects on Japan, on white-collar suburbs in the Kansai area, and then it's still one of the areas that I studied. It's early childhood education in Japan. Physically speaking, I was the biggest kindergarten teacher in Japan. A number of times when I did field work. It was on Hoikuen, not Yochie. At the end of the 80s, when I had already developed, if you could call it, an expertise in things Japanese, I began, for personal reasons, to study the Israeli military. And then peacekeeping forces around Israel, and the militaries of the industrial democracies. And then I thought to myself that given the investment, my personal investment in things Japanese, it could be interesting to study the Japanese self-defense forces as well. And I've been studying the self-defense forces in one way or another for the past 10 or 12 years. The beginning was with a cultural historian named Sabina Frühstück, who now teaches in the US. And we published a number of things together. And when I say I'm an anthropologist, this is the way I like, or I think there is a fruitfulness in approaching the military, or even civil-military relations from an anthropological or a more cultural point of view. And this will be my emphasis today. So if you ask me, about the latest military technology and so on, I can point to Andrew or other people who are greater experts than myself. One more point. For those of you who have not taken their Ritalin this morning, I will be speaking for about 35 minutes. Okay? That was a joke, and I was told there are Americans in the crowd and I have to begin.
Yeah, they take attention deficit disorder.
Yes, they're shaking already. A number of developments in regard to the Japan Self-Defense Forces. I'll go through it very, very quickly. Most of you, if not all of you, know these things, such as the new legislative measures, the advent of the defense ministry, and so on. What I do want to emphasize are what I call other transformations, such as the sacking of General Togami, who was the head of the Japanese Air Force, and something really interesting, which I'll get back to in my talk. Last week, I read that in psychotherapy, or teaching Hoikuen teachers in Tohoku, to work with the children, to work through the difficulties that they have encountered with the children, that they invoke self-defense forces, soldiers, as sort of comforting figures, supportive figures. And I think this is related, or this should be seen alongside the more political changes that the self-defense forces have undergone. Now, until the year 2000, in the wake of Ozawa's talking about Japan becoming a normal state, there were many articles and books talking about the normalization of Japan, and specifically the normalization of the self-defense forces. And these are just some of the examples of books or names of books and articles. But this emphasis on or questioning of whether the self-defense forces has been or is being normalized has continued since the year 2000. And of course I include Andrew Horowiz's book, Normalizing Japan, Rethinking about Japan as a Normal Country, and so on and so on. There's almost what could be called an academic normalization industry in regard to the self-defense forces here. At base are anxieties or worries about the potential for Japan to become militaristic, not to remilitarize so much in terms of the technology and personnel, but also deeper worries, or worries that are related to those anxieties about the extent to which the military will continue to be subordinate to the civilian politicians. Okay? Now, I thought to myself, what does this mean, all this element of normalization? And I want to suggest to you that when we think about the Japanese military, we should think about it in terms of both the uniqueness of the peculiar, particular characteristics of Japan after World War II, but also very much in terms of the problems that the military institutions of any industrial democracy faces. The military is unlike other institutions. Its expertise lies in the organization, the management, and the use of organized or collective violence. This is what the military is about. It's not a cuchi-muchi peacekeeping forces, Northern California way to the military. Okay? It has to do with organized and collective violence. And for a whole range of cultural and social reasons, the place of violence, of collective organized violence in all of the industrial democracies is either questioned or challenged or put up for public debate in ways that have become, I think, rather interesting since the end of the Cold War. Questions, for example, about Canada participating in peacekeeping have to do very much with the place of whether Canada should use its potential for organized or collective violence in various peace support operations rather than peacekeeping. And it's true for many, many other industrial democracies. Of course, the primary one being the one that I belong to, if Israel is a democracy, Israel. In Japan, all of this, if you like, I hesitate to use the word problematic, but all the special status of the military is intensified because of the horrendous experience of World War II. Again, things that, talking to this audience, you probably know. The country's defeat was blamed on the military. Of course, all of this was heightened by the effects of the atomic bomb and the legal limits, a whole range of pacifist social movements. If you just look at Okinawa, the continued resistance to the presence of the American military is Okinawa is a special case, but it's also part of a wider national debate about the place of the military and the American military in Japan itself. In reality, one of my teachers in Israel, Ben-Ami Shiloni, who has, how shall I put it, a rather rosy picture of Japan, always maintains that Japan and Costa Rica are the only countries in the world with no military. And I often ask him, why does Japan keep these jet fighters? Sort of to get people who speed on the highways, I guess. So on. Japan has a military. It looks, acts, to a great extent, as an anthropologist, I can tell you, also smells like a military. In terms of the oil, the munitions, and so on. It has the latest military technology, and again, I won't go into this in great detail. It looks very much like the American military in terms of the various services and the relations between them, and so on. Now, in academia, I have rule number 47, Ben-Ari. which says the best way to get famous in the academic world is to pick an argument with somebody more famous than you. Preferably dead. Now, there are a lot of living people, political scientists, and I say this with all respect, Andrew, I'm not... but I want to suggest that the political scientists have a lot to say about the normalization of the self-defense forces, and I'll show in what way I mean normalization, but that they don't go, if you like, far enough. There are other dimensions which should be taken into account. And I'm going to talk, as I review the literature on normalization, I want to argue that there are 5 different types of normalization that we should talk about. First of all, in terms of legalization, political scientists have done an excellent job of tracing out the changes in the legal status of the self-defense forces. Second one has to do with creating an image of necessity. You need us for national security, to put it in rather simplistic terms. But also, I think that in order to understand the way the self-defense forces normalize themselves, we have to see the way they distance themselves from the legacies of the imperial military, and especially the imperial army, more than the navy. Another form of normalization is turning the self-defense forces into what we in anthropology or sociology call a natural, a taken for granted part of society. And the final way in which I'm going to talk about normalization is saying we are like any other military. We are similar to the American or the European or the Australian or New Zealand militaries. So it's the last 3 terms which I want to develop here, but I want to go very, very quickly through the methodology. I've done ethnographic research, mainly interviews and observations in these years, interviews, visits to various bases, including, and I thank very much our representative from the National Defense Academy for hosting me and letting me interview their students and them. And of course, newspapers. So let me go rather quickly through the first 2 forms of normalization. When we say that an institution is normalized, it becomes, in one sense, legal. And we've seen, especially since the end of the Cold War, more than 20 pieces of legislation, one example being the Emergency Situation Law, the continued importance of the alliance with the United States as pushing for these legal changes to take place. Yet these processes of legalization have continued to be contested both within Japan and outside Japan by their neighbors. And if you notice, accompanying almost every piece of legislation are demonstrations, very often editorials in newspapers, and very, very often we find external criticism from Japan's neighbors. Okay. What we do find are changing public attitudes. I'll just give you one example, and that is when Japan deployed to Samawa in southern Iraq in the 2000s, the early 2000s, a very large minority, almost 50%, supported the deployment, and something like it was 52% were against it. After the deployment was finished, a majority, a significant majority, were very satisfied with the deployment itself. So we have slight changes in public attitudes as measured by public opinion polls. Again, we can go into this afterwards. The second one, the second form of normalization carried out by the self-defense forces themselves or by politicians is to convince the public that they are necessary. I remember when North Korea fired its missile over Japan, I think it was 98 or 99. I talked, 99, right? I interviewed a brigadier general in the Japanese forces, and more or less he said, this is the greatest thing that has happened to the Self-Defense Forces. Why, of course? Because the public will realize that there is a threat there. Okay? I'm being very cynical here, but this is the way the militaries as actors, of course, think and act. And of course, among other blessings are North Korean incursions and the missiles, I said, and so on. It's not often talked about publicly, but when you talk to officers, of course, they realize that China can emerge as a credible threat. And again, I'm putting it a bit cynically, maybe even simplistically, the USSR has gone. Thank God, quote unquote, that we now have China. We have a way to legitimate ourselves, legitimate the resources that we ask the politicians to give us, legitimate the support that we ask the public for, and so on. Behind all of this is something which I think should be emphasized. The self-defense forces are not puppets. They are actors. They are political actors with their own organizational interests. And they are actors in the political arena. Very often, not always, but very often in coalition with politicians, or I should say certain politicians. So we should not see them as sort of a passive set of actors, but very active. But this strategy still remains problematic to an extent in Japan because of the anti-militaristic ethos, external pressures, continued dependence on the US. I've just given you a number of examples of places in Japan. Just look at the bottom hand slide. This is a drill carried out by the self-defense forces for evacuating Japanese citizens abroad. The drill was carried out in Japan itself, but for example, if, that's an example, the Belgians take over Amsterdam, and the self-defense forces have to very quickly evacuate Japanese citizens living in Amsterdam, some of them in certain alternative states of consciousness, they can do it rather easily, okay? But again, by holding these drills, by reporting about these drills to the public, they appear in the newspapers, what does the military do, and politicians? Signal that there's a necessity for being prepared for various kinds of eventualities. Like, rather cynically, I'm Israeli, so please excuse me for being sarcastic sometimes. It's a cultural disorder, not personal. Threats galore. Chinese ships, warships, patrolling in various areas. And of course, again, not to be cynical, this is the colonel in charge of the nuclear radiation decontamination unit of the self-defense forces. With the idea, again, that there are various kinds of threats. If you like, the conventional and the non-conventional. Without going, it's not a nuclear a bomb, but it's a non-conventional kind of threat which the military deals with. These are the first two types of normalization. The third way in which the military has normalized itself is by creating a distance between itself and the imperial military. One example is the new language and the ranks, the new words, the new terms that the self-defense forces created after World War II, very different from the imperial ones. And soldiers are not heishi or gunjin, but special public servants. By the way, within the military, they can use the military terms. This is for public consumption. My favorite are Tokubetsu Hikoki and these kinds of things. It's not just, this, again, to be fair, has very, very slowly changing. It's much more acceptable today to use regular military terms. Okay? But you've created the distance, and now you can slowly argue that you're establishing a regular, quote-unquote, military. This again has changed, something very interesting. I invited some Israelis and we went out to Roppongi, this is about 10 years ago, and I said to them, you know, look around you. A lot of the people walking around here in civilian suits are actually military officers. When they would leave the headquarters, they would disguise themselves as civilians. Okay? Again, a distancing from their military identity. Again, very, very slowly changing. And a variety of soft representations through public relations offices, visits to camps and so on. Examples are, this is the Blue Impulse team on the left-hand side. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're sort of the aerial acrobatic team of the Air Force, the Japan Air Force, or the Self-Defense Air Forces. And on the right-hand side, the right-hand slide is a visit, I think it was from Yokosuka, where the public is invited to go on ships and see what is happening. I think I missed, yeah, all right. I think I missed a, yeah, apologies, okay.
Yeah, violence. There's the one you missed.
No. Before I get to this, for some reason I deleted it. When I'm talking about a softening of the image, I think the Japanese military is the only military in the world which has manga characters. Okay, these cute little figures on tanks or on, and I have great pictures of them, but forget it now. They're called Prince Pickles, I think, and Princess, I forgot the name at this stage. Now, of course, the point is that in the Japanese popular mind, this evokes images of manga characters and maybe childhood memories. But by branding, or having a certain element of the branding in terms of manga characters, there's a softening here. Another point, really, really interesting, is I invite you to look at recruitment posters. I think only about 60% of the self-defense forces are women, but 50% of the recruitment posters have women in them. Again, the idea, if you look at it culturally, at the message that is being portrayed there, it's a softening of the image. And very, very different, again, from the imperial, if you like, the macho image of the imperial soldiers, especially the military, to an extent also the Navy in this case. A fourth way of normalizing, here I become really an anthropologist, is creating what could be called a ritual cycle of a whole variety of events held by the self-defense forces. There are, first of all, annual parades, flotillas, and flypasts. Each year there's a different one. Okay, just an example. The bottom right-hand picture is taken from a parade in Tokyo, and this is from a ceremony before the flotilla, which goes around the bay. There are, as I said before, open days in specific bases. There are also a variety of ceremonies which are broadcast or reported about in the newspapers. For example, when a contingent left for Iraq, or when it came back, it was reported in the media, very often in the television and so on. The same place when they go to a very, very dangerous place in the world where we take our vacation, the Golan Heights. Okay? There's a going away ceremony and there's a coming back ceremony. But if you think again of the idea of, I'm a person who reads a newspaper, a daily newspaper, without even reading the item, the news item, I get these pictures throughout the year of various, if you like, rituals that take place related to the military. It becomes an annual cycle, something which you don't think about. And it's exactly this element of you don't think about, which I'm trying to get at, that it's normal, it's taken for granted, it's a natural, quote unquote, part of our reality in Japan. The final meaning of normalization, as I see it, is that the self-defense forces conform to some kind of global standard of what a military should be like, with the assumption being that a normal military is like the military of any industrial democracy. Again, Western Europe, to an extent the US, Canada, and so on. Of course, there are elements related to the host of common or joint maneuvers with various militaries, which have expanded over the last 15 years. Not only the Americans, the South Koreans, the Australians, the Singaporeans, and again, this gets reported. So if I, as a member of the self-defense forces, participate in a joint drill, there is some kind of similarity. Again, I'm reading it as, in cultural terms. The message is that there's some kind of likeness, some kind of similarity. So we're like them. We're like the Singaporeans, we're like the South Koreans, and so on. This being the idea. But these are examples of joint drills with the Americans. The bottom one is with US forces, and so on. But the participation in peacekeeping forces is also peace support operations, I should say, in humanitarian missions, is again very much like the new missions that the militaries of the industrial democracies talk about. So if forces from Western Europe send people to Cambodia or other places where the self-defense forces were sent, you're creating this similarity. Again, very, very strong in Japan is the participation and help with disasters. 3/11 in Tohoku, snow avalanches, road repair, building community amenities, crashed airplanes. There are many, many missions which are carried out, again, in the same way that the German military, for example, the contemporary German military, helps when there's flooding in Germany itself. Again, a very few examples. The top left-hand one is from Iraq, Samawa. The bottom left-hand one is from one of the northern prefectures. I forget which one. I think it's Niigata, where the self-defense forces helped with the snow. And of course, the sad, tremendous effort put in by the self-defense forces in the disaster in Tohoku. Okay? This, I think, if I were to extrapolate into the future, this will be a major event for legitimizing and for, again, to use jargon that we in sociology and anthropology will use, for getting for garnering symbolic capital on the part of the self-defense forces. It began in Kobe as a major national event, but it will continue here. Again, examples of from the talk. For a while, again, you were probably exposed to it even more than me. There were reports about the self-defense forces in Tohoku a number of times a day, including interviews. You saw them helping the elderly children, looking for bodies, and of course, the participation of various self-defense forces units in the nuclear disaster itself. So to conclude, as I promised I would speak for about 35 minutes, I'd like to emphasize a number of things. First of all, the point is that the self-defense forces are an actor. We have to take them very, very seriously. It's not just a case or just a factor of, call it, the right-wing politicians that are pushing this militarization and so on. But the self-defense forces, like any military, are hugely important and very, very strong political actor. And I'm talking about the fact that they may talk the rhetoric of being subordinate to the civilians, and they are. But they are political actors. They have public relations offices, they appear in the media, and so on. The second point, and that is what I tried to get across today, is that normalization to a great extent has to do with what we could call increased legitimacy in a variety of ways. And what I try to get across is the variety of means or strategies by which this legitimacy is constantly created, cultivated, maintained. My last point, and this is hopefully to open up a discussion, is a point that is made by one of my colleagues in Israel named Yagi Levy. He suggests that we differentiate between control of the military and control of militarization, or militarism, I should say. In Japan, as I see it, the problem is less with the control of the military. In the foreseeable future, the military will not take over the government. There will not be a return, if you like, to some kind of World War II kind of situation. But rather, the public debates are to a great extent about the militaristic tendencies which can be found among various political camps. And the military participates in these debates whether it wants to or not, through the various means that it uses in order to normalize itself. Now it's written down here to ask if there are any questions. So I'll ask if there are any questions.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there will be many questions. I'll take the advantage of sharing this.
No problem.
To ask the first question. You said it looks like a military, it smells like a military. There's military and there's military. I mean, not all militaries are equal. They have different relationships with violence. They have different training programs. I mean, in some militaries, training is a lot softer than in others. I mean, they're different. They reflect the geopolitics of their countries. So I assume you obviously have a lot of experience with the Israeli military. How would you compare the SDF with the Israel Defense Forces in terms of what you might call the military ethos? I mean, if you were to compare a group of both officers and enlisted men, especially in the ground services of the two countries, which is probably the service where the difference is the greatest, because I mean, air forces and navies tend to be much more technical and therefore more standardized, regardless of the country. What would come to your mind as a difference?
Okay. First of all, I wouldn't compare them. My answer is serious. I would not compare them to the Israeli military. I would compare them in a much more serious way to the German, the Norwegian, the Swedish, the Dutch, the Belgian militaries. Now, why do I say that? Until Iraq and Afghanistan, to a great extent, these militaries were, after the end of the Cold War, there was a question whether they could be real militaries, where they could really participate in violent encounters with various violent others. And having done research on Sweden, for example, the participation of Swedish forces, special forces, in the Congo on the one hand and in Iraq on the other, has proven to be quite a success. And I would class at this stage, again, I'm not an expert on military capabilities as such, but I would class the self-defense forces much more along the lines of these forces, where training is probably softer than the American or the French or the British, to call those the fighting militaries. But still there's a very serious emphasis on potentially credible situations in which they'll find themselves. And the seriousness of the anti-piracy deployment, on the one hand, and the deployment in Iraq, I think brought not only to the public, but to many members of the self-defense forces, the seriousness of training for so-called real situations.
But I'm sure, thank you, Eyal. I'm sure there are many questions. Can you just identify yourself? Yes.
Yeah, my name's Dave. I do comedy, but I'm not going to ask anything funny. One quick comment and a question. And the quick comment is being, I was up in Ishinomaki volunteering, where the Navy had deployed an onsen to much of the delight of everybody in the area. So, and sorry, a hot spring, like a hot bath?
No, yeah, I just didn't hear you.
Oh, sorry, yeah. And it just makes a great metaphor for what you're saying, partly because it was an incredible PR move, but also because I tried to strike up a conversation with the soldiers there, and it was some of the most awkward conversations of my life. They had no idea what to do with me or anyone else. So there was just a sort of like, they got into the service for one reason, and now they were doing something completely else. They didn't know what to do. That's just as a comment, so to sort of appreciate what you're talking about. My question is a little bit more broad-reaching. Having been to the Yasuguni Jinja and Museum, it's obvious that there's an element in Japan which would like to see a Japan that has a place in the world very similar to America. I don't think they want to go, say, invade Manchuria again, but they would like to have zones of influence and that much control, and that obviously comes with a massive military. This sort of perception, I think, in society is that Japan is held back on having this military because of Article 9. And there's all sorts of debate about whether they should have it. The right-wing guys like to focus on it, and the left-wing guys like to focus on it. But given that the U.S., when they invaded, and as you know, when they invade other countries, phrase it as national defense. And even in the Yasuguni thing, I saw that there was, when Japan invaded Korea earlier in the 1930s, they described it as being a defensive position to take to stop terrorism coming over from Korea. Does Article 9 really matter? Because can't they put whatever their military aspirations are, whatever zones they hope to achieve, can't they just phrase it as national defense and essentially do whatever they want?
First of all, there are greater experts than myself about this specific issue. Andrew, would you like to say something?
Well,
no, simply because...
Yeah. But I think you're more like, I mean, not the legal technicality of whether or not they could do it,
okay,
but sort of the perception, like if you're right when you die and you say, I want to go invade somewhere else, I can call, you know, couldn't I just call this a defensive posture and go
the way all of the missions outside Japan have been framed in terms of general understanding, I'm not going into legal technicalities, has been in one way or another in terms of rather than national defense, than national interest.
Hasn't it been phrased as humanitarian?
Wait a second.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is like in Israel. That's fine.
I'm trying to, you know,
no,
make you feel at home.
That's fine. I don't get flustered by Israeli type of behavior. I want to continue that.
Yeah.
When I say national interest, it could be translated in different ways. One way, the more obvious one, is the anti-piracy deployment. We, the Japanese government or the state, have an interest in keeping the sea lanes open so that trade can take place, import, export. The same goes for the Malaccan Straits and so on. It's not just the Gulf of Aden and that area, or off Somalia. That's the more obvious. Peacekeeping and humanitarian deployments outside Japan have been framed in terms of Japan taking its rightful place in terms of a contribution to sort of, if you like, the global community on the one hand, and being like any other state in terms of not only putting up the funds, which Japan has done to a great extent for many, many years, but also in terms of putting forces on the ground. In terms of the internal debate, of course, the first deployments were in terms of peacekeeping, in terms of humanitarian aid, and then it was, I think, the way I read it, relatively easy to add other elements of sort of collective defense. Again, in terms of the popular understandings. This would be my way of understanding what is happening. About the first element of Tohoku, I think that because of what has happened, the American invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, this issue has been put to the side to an extent, but around the militaries of the industrial democracies in the end of the 90s and beginning of the 2000s, again, this will sound cynical, and maybe it is a bit cynical, but a number of military commentators, especially in Europe, began to talk about environmental threats, not water wars in the sense that it'll devolve into various kinds of armed conflict, but rather in terms of the military should prepare for avalanches, flooding, earthquake, and so on. That fits to a great extent within a framework which says the military of a nation deals with various kinds of threats to populations and so on. To my Israeli students, I usually say, I'd like a hamburger and chips. Sorry,
your follow-up on this.
Yeah.
Andrew, just identify yourself.
Sure, I'm Andrew Oros from Washington College and a visiting professor at KO now. I have a comment that is really a question in terms of would you agree, but I really like your presentation and I love your Sabine's work from before. But when you talk about the 5 types of normalization, which I think is really useful, I wonder, it seems to me the first 4 that you mentioned, the legalization and creating an image of necessity, distancing from imperial forces, and making the self-defense forces kind of a natural part of society, I see that as a long trend, and you've written about this and others have built on that idea. But your 5th point about, I agree that conceptually I think an aspect of normalization in Japan today is this idea that the self-defense forces are just like any other military. But I think that conceptually it's different than those first 4 points, and I see it both as something newer, but also something that's more controversial, and that's kind of the question or the comment I would make, that I think that the earlier question builds on this as well, that do the self-defense forces really want to be just like any other military and participating in peacekeeping operations in a military sense, or do they want to be a different kind of military? Where they don't use weapons, they build bridges, and they clean water and things like that. And in my view, I think there's a very big debate about that in Japan today. And I think that this links to your really useful attention to images and rituals. And this is to be my last comment, but I think that the manga image of the self-defense forces and the cutesy commercials where the self-defense forces officers dance to disco music, and the gifts that I get from the Ministry of Defense when I visit, of Prince Pickles and these cute images, now are, I think, pretty much evenly balanced with the new gifts I get are of the latest fighter planes and calendars that have things actually exploding, which I was really shocked. The 2011 calendar, actually next month, the August month, has an explosion in it. And I'm struck by that difference, and so I wonder what kinds of implications that has for whether you see this as a new step or you see this new directions, or when you speak to people on the SDF, you talk about the SDF as an actor. Are they trying to make this change, or who's leading this?
There are a number of questions there. First of all, I do think that there is a more, how should I put it, a clearer depiction of the violent potential of the self-defense forces in public imagery, put it that way. It all the way, again, if I were to trace out images in Iraq with the flak jackets and the helmets, it doesn't have to be with guns already, but that is signaling that you're in a violent environment. This is very interesting about the August month with the explosion, because I think there's a more of a series of being clearer about this potential. This is one point. The second, the last time I had really serious talks, not just lunch or things like that, with military officers was in 2005. There was a sizable minority who wanted, as people that I met way back in my first fieldwork at the beginning of the 1980s here in Japan, who wanted a good job, a steady salary, maybe interesting, be out in nature, hike a bit or so on. But there is, I think, and I would be interested in your opinion, among younger people being recruited into the military, into the Japanese military, a greater realization that they may be deployed into real missions. As to your third question about who is behind this, I don't think there's a conspiracy theory there. I don't think there are a number of military people who sit there behind the scenes with politicians and plan. Journalists may like this image. Sorry?
And political science.
And political science, yes, but I have to be very, very polite or I'll be kicked out.
I'm not a political scientist.
Oh, you're not?
Certainly not.
But some of my friends are.
Okay, and you may bring them in, okay. But seriously speaking, I think it has to do with processes of socialization. That is, you become a soldier. You become an officer. You're not only in Japan. Already when you're even a young officer or a young soldier, there are various types of, and I remember many stories told to us, Sabina and myself, by sort of ordinary soldiers where they're trained with the Americans, and the Americans are much more professional than them and so on. And the way they phrased it was in terms of, we should be like them. They're a model to emulate. So I think it's more a set of, for lack of a better term, cultural institutional dynamics rather than a sort of a conscious decision by a cabal of officers or something like that.
Thank you.
Can you please identify yourself?
Yes, of course.
And then,
My name is Alan Hulse, and I teach at Kanagawa Daigaku, Jindai. You mentioned, that there's not a cabal of officers, and there's obviously not a conspiracy, even though journalists, or as the professor there noted, professors might like such an image. But clearly, someone is behind the promoting of these positive images, and someone is helping orchestrate the production of these images for public consumption. Is the GA-Tai, the Self-Defense Forces, the Boei show, using the services of organizations such as Dentsu for such productions, and is even your presence here part of such production?
If anything, I was sent here by the Mossad.
That would be conspiratorial.
The last point.
Yeah.
The very fact that I am here, I think, should be seen as part of the normalization process, by the way. The fact, I'll get back to your point before, the fact that there's more research, that it's more legitimate to research the self-defense forces, not only from a automatically left-wing or critical view, is part of a process of normalization. That is, the fact that we can create knowledge in terms of military sociology, like military sociologists created about any other military, is part of this process. But that I'll leave aside for a second. we talked in, I think it was 2000, to the head of public relations in the ground self-defense forces, okay? What in America would be called the Army. This was a time when Dentsu was not recruited, was contracted by the self-defense forces. They're the ones who came up with the Prince Pickles and the manga characters and so on. Talking to him, my impression was something akin to talking to any senior manager in a corporate enterprise who would use a marketing firm or an advertising firm to make the image of the organization more positive. Just to give you an example, I did research on Japanese business people in Singapore, and we found very similar kinds of things there. Okay? But, of course, as I said before, the military is not like Sony or Toyota or even TEPCO. Okay?
I hope so.
We hope so, yes. Because it deals with violence. This general that we talked to, he didn't use the word violence. Okay? This is, if you like, it's much more of an academic or a sociological definition of what the military is. But he did talk, for example, about Honma no Guntai, a real military, these kinds of terms. And he would say things, we have a problem being accepted by the general public. And because popular culture is populated by these manga characters, it's only natural that we use them. To see the whole public relations effort as orchestrated, yes, I would agree. Most definitely. But the fact that all these, for example, ceremonies that I talked about before are held, sure, somebody organizes them, but I don't think they're not sophisticated. It's not so sophisticated to think about the unintended consequences of holding all these ceremonies. So that when you talk to them, they say, yes, it's important to have these ceremonies. For example, when a unit goes away, or when it gets deployed, and when it gets brought back home. It's important for the public and so on. The way I read it is I start to put all these things together. And in that sense, I don't think it's orchestrated. But that does not make it less significant.
Did you answer the second part of the question?
Which was?
Your own presence here in this room.
Yeah, I did at the beginning. I said the fact that it's more legitimate to do research.
As a researcher.
Right? That we can have public presentations from a so-called neutral or academic point of view.
It's just that you said we can have.
Well, I think that in Japan, one can have.
And when you were talking in answering the question here, you said in terms of anti-piracy missions, we, the Japanese, have an interest. We, the Japanese.
No.
So you switched.
No, when I said we, I was sort of taking up the role of being a Japanese policymaker with a salary better than mine.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Garen Malloy, Daito Bunki University, and I'm sorry I arrived just in time for the end of your presentation, so I'm basically not able to ask you questions on your presentation, but I have read some of your work, and it's based upon some of the answers you're giving to comments. It's not actually, it's a series of comments actually. I've done a lot of work on the JPEG. People are asking where are the policy drivers, essentially, for moving towards more of a culture of violence, I think is just to sort of paraphrase what people were saying. I think if you look within the Jietai, within all three, but particularly the Rikijo Jietai, I think if you actually talk to people at differing levels, your differentiation not only of age but rank is spot on. But there's also something else, which is experience. And if you talk to officers, sorry, not just officers, but I have primarily talked with officers who've been on peacekeeping and other overseas dispatch operations and have felt them to be in some way meaningful, then their view of the JTI is very different from someone who's been sat in a T-90 tank charging around Hokkaido. It's a very, very different view. And I experienced this also similarly different view as an infantry officer who went to Northern Ireland. And comparing this to armoured officers who were racing around the fields of Germany, there was a very different conception of what the role of the military was. This is not unique for Japan.
Exactly.
So I would say that absolutely you're right in that sense. But the value of experience is also important when we're looking at the recent Tohoku operations. Because I spoke to officers who participated in operations in Niigata and after the Hanshin earthquake in '95. And that experience as well had a profound effect on them. And I'm sure that you know the work of military sociologists like Kawano-san at Koreidai.
He's here.
Oh, where is he? Hello! And also Kurashina-san, she's an American, well,
She did it in Maryland.
yeah, basing a lot on Kawano-sensei's work.
Yes.
And looking at the increasing constabulary culture of the J-type as derived from the operational stance that they've taken. Because they've never been in operations where they've actually used violence, but they've been in operations where they've actually acted as peaceful constabulary occupations. But I would take some exception only with what I've read, not of course with your presentation, with your conceptions of normalization. And I agree with the previous commentator that the 5 types you have, very useful, very good indeed. But when I was reading through it and trying to apply it to the J-type, I found the first 2 worked, and the final 3 didn't. The last one, the 5th one, is of course the interesting one, because the J-type, because of what I previously said, have this Jekyll and Hyde character. They wish to be, and have always wished to be, just like the Americans. And yet they don't. They wish to be, and they don't. And there is this element within the J-type, particularly in the ground forces, where there's this Jekyll and Hyde. There's less of it in the Kaido J-type and the Kobe J-type. But I would, obviously say that I don't necessarily agree with your conceptions of normalization and how they can be applied to the Japanese. I like the division, but if I was taking those 5 as my standard, I would say that normalization cannot take place. If all 5 must take place. I say the first 2, yes. 3rd and 4th I would say no, and the 5th one I would say conditionally, because it's a sense that they wish to be like the Americans. And like the British and the Australians, who they increasingly are working closely with. But there's always this sense of wishing to hold back, because there's the sense of luxury. We want to be like them. And look at us, we have the tanks and the aircraft and the Aegis destroyers, we can be like them. And yet, we don't want to be. And we can't be because of these restrictions. In some ways the restrictions are seen as external, but in some ways the restrictions are seen as having become part of the culture of the force. I'm sorry, I know I'm long-winded, but I am British, I'm terribly sorry.
We forgive you. No, seriously now. I think you actually, perhaps inadvertently, at the beginning of your comments, said a number of things which will relate, or which are related to the things that you ended with. I'll put it in terms of a hypothesis, which is certainly happening in other militaries, and I know there are particular characteristics in Japan. The more, this is happening in Sweden to an extent which they don't believe, the more there is deployment outside in missions that are close to or resemble real missions, that is where violence is used. Either is withstood or used on others. The more there is participation in serious disasters, man-made or natural, like the Tohoku, which is not like clearing snow off in Niigata. Very, very different, because you're facing death. You're facing the violent implications of a natural cause, if you like. That, I would say that that would be a driving force, rather than a policy driver, but a very serious driving force in terms of people's perception of who they are as military people. To an extent, this is military men. It's politically correct to say military people. It's military men, in effect. Now, I don't think that this is a particularly fast process, but I see differences even over the last decade or so, where, if you like, the Mr. Hyde, it depends how you look at the Mr. Hyde and Dr. Jekyll, okay, where the peacenik side of the Jietai is being, I wouldn't say eroded, because then it implicates a whole set of issues for civil-military relations and so on. But the element of being like other militaries, and at least the people that I talk to, is becoming stronger and stronger.
I am Yüksel'de representing Turkish Central here in Tokyo. My question is related to the financial crisis as well. And if we assume we see another global crisis in the following 5 years, and suddenly Americans going back to their homeland everywhere, including Asia and Middle East, and there is a chaos in the world and trade channels is closed. What will happen in Japan in such a scenario?
Could you give me the pessimistic scenario also? I would find that really difficult to answer. It depends very much on even a less extreme scenario, but where there is a gradual, for a whole range of reasons, a gradual withdrawal of America and its commitment to this area. It'll be a very big question of the place of China, perhaps a resurgent Russia, although I don't see it in the near future. It's these kinds of issues. I would find it very difficult to answer that kind of question.
Subtle businessman, small business owner, investor as well. There are three things that I would like to say that I heard your comments. The first one is that no matter what we think, there are always resistance from, namely China, Korea, against the Japanese normalization of the military expansion. To which I say, just please be sitting aside. We are trying to defend our country. And as the gentleman from Turkey said, that's the step number one, to normalize Japan. The second one is that what is happening in tsunami areas where my brother lived, they get a tremendous admiration from the residents, like distributing diapers to the elderly people, something like that. So never ever think of it. And they are doing that. And also they are facing the tremendous risk of the second hit of tsunami. That can be possible. And also the series of disastrous things, events, military treaty issues in Okinawa, and like the gentleman says, if US evacuates Japan, what will happen? Despite the invasion from the air by Russians and the sea by Chinese. Now, Japan should defend our own territory. And also the people say, like the doctor says, the chart analysis of Japanese military budget, always thinking below GDP 1%, which I'm totally against. There is a way to expand the Japanese economy. That's expenditure to increase the military budget. And free trade, export the weapons. That we can do. And I think I admire Japanese Jeitai for the first time that I admit they are the real force and extremely effective force. If something happens, then I depend on them because there is a great hope and quality, and I feel very proud of it. So I am supporting the Japanese policymakers to support Jeitai. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just, is that true that the Japanese military budget is going down? I'd actually heard that it's one, like they have one of the largest militaries in the region, like that.
No.
No. But the budget's going down.
So they have an existing military that's already large, but the budget, the yearly budget going into it is going down.
8 years ago.
Okay.
It says we're sort of doing a second round, it seems. I'm just curious, I mean, I think that Sato-san represents a point of view that is very widely held in Japan. I mean, sorry?
Held by Japanese businessmen.
Well, and others.
Good.
But I mean, I say very widely, not that it's a majority opinion, but I mean, I think quite a few Japanese have that view. But I mean, in my work, what I sort of am trying to elucidate is that that's always been the case in post-war Japan. I mean, there's always been a large group of people who wanted Japan to have a bigger military and have been sort of advocating for that process. But there's also always been a large group of people who don't want Japan to have a normal military in the way that your fifth category is, right? A military like everyone else. And in my opinion, that hasn't really changed much in the last few years. We still have these sort of two kind of camps. And so I find it, I'm a bit puzzled in a way why the representations have changed so much. And you know, maybe it's because actually the kind of Sato-sans of the world are becoming a bigger group, or it's about generational change. But so that's sort of one comment. But related to that, the kind of the very recent thing is the earthquake, and you know, I think that it's only been a few months. Right, but it seems to me that it's becoming more and more the sort of received wisdom that this is changing Japanese views of the self-defense forces. But I guess I'll put myself out on a limb to say I'd like to see the evidence of that over the next couple of years. Because to me, I think it shows the same tension that your whole presentation has been talking about. The group of Japanese who want to see the self-defense forces be able to rescue you in the case of a natural disaster, or to help build beautiful snow sculptures in Sapporo, versus the group of Japanese who want the self-defense forces to be respected in the world as a major military force. I think that that tension is just as present as it was 10 years ago.
I think one element which we must take into account is generational. There's some research on collective memory carried out by, I think it's a very good researcher in Hokkaido University named Philip Seaton. And one of the things that it's based on empirical data. I think mostly public opinion polls, from what I remember. But the acrimony surrounding the debate about what we could call the normalization of the self-defense forces, the intensity has lowered. Among other reasons, because of the indifference, sheer indifference of younger generations, I use the plural. And one could read that indifference in a variety of ways, but one of the ways is that since there is less political commitment to a critical stance of Japan's militarization and militarism, then this leaves, certainly at the level of public representations, of public debate, this allows a much more vociferous, noisy, stronger voicing of what, for lack of a better term, we can call your right-wing opinions and so on. So one certainly has to put it in the context of changing generations and views of politics in Japan. Because the huge anti-military stance was carried by certainly many post-war intellectuals, even into the 1960s, the radicals on the left and so on. And their place in society has changed and is changing.
Megan?
Megan Cano, looking for crown relocations, but right now speaking as the mother of two young men in the self-defense forces, one in the air, one in the ground forces. On your normalizations, one of the things that appears to be off your radar is, to back up a little bit, in Japanese schools, they grade the schools by the normative curve, and everybody's hopes to be above average. You have to be over 51st.
Right.
For the schools that deal with, say, 53rd to 42nd percentile, that tend to be technical schools, many of them are feeder schools for the military. The military come out on their school festivals, hey, come up in the helicopter with us, aren't we cool, you know, sure, climb in, we've you know, we've removed the key from the ignition, go ahead, climb around on the tank. And they show up year after year, little air show, good public relations, talk with the parents, make the, you know, I'm a regular person type of a feel, and those schools are feeder schools for that. My question is, my big concern is not control of the military, but the control of militarization. Is there a counterforce against the increasing appeal of militarization around the world? Because they've got Han Kandu books, they've got a whole different set of history books. My kids read in school, and I was saying, hey, this is not the stuff that, you know, you see when you look at the Monbusho displays and things. It's sort of a different take on history. It's a lot of Senkan Yamato glorification. Is there anything that you see as counterbalancing that?
Again, there are two sets of questions, or there's a comment and a question. The question is, and I think it's related to developments in the in many of the industrial democracies as well. The old, let me put it this way, the old clear division between the right and the left, or the Democrats, well, the Democrats and the Republicans, we'll leave it aside, America's problematic. There's a, certainly in Europe, of course we have governments that lean towards this side or towards that side, but there's much more of the creation of a middle ground with many common policies. And not that I see so much the emergence of some kind of widespread consensus and so on, because it still feeds into party politics and party competitions and so on. But certainly the older, strong, very vocal anti-military coalition in Japan is not as strong as it used to be. That's about what I do.
Yuki Yoshikawa, the Russian Center. What if you have to say one reason why the normalization has not been that hinders the normalization, what would you point out? Like you have mentioned about generational issues, but like if that is true, then like is the policy of the SDF or the people like you think that the player is doing the right choice of the policy mix?
From the point of view of the self-defense forces, they're doing the right things. Yes.
Right. And what do you think the reason that hinders? I mean, like that in order to lower the barrier hurdle of the normalization, what is the hurdle from the first place, and then like if the SDF's policy is right choice to lower that hurdle?
Okay, I did it very, very quickly in my presentation here. After World War II, things related to the military were perceived to a great extent as almost synonymous with disaster. Japan is victim, so it's true that the Americans dropped the atomic bomb, but this was brought about because of the military regime in Japan and so on. The status of people who went to the military was very low. I remember in I think it was 1995, talking to a military officer, and he told me that he was driving his Jeep outside Osaka somewhere in his uniform, and he stops at a traffic light, and the windows were open, and a family stops next to him. And the mother says to the children, "Do you see that guy in the uniform?" The children said, "Yes." It says, and she said to them, "If you don't study, you'll turn out like him." Now, this is indicative of the kind of status. And I think what is and he said that with great sorrow, and of course so. And this was an earlier age, but he was already a lieutenant colonel then. But I think that the process is cumulative. It's not that there's a transformative event, but it's one event that is based on another. You cannot understand the anti-piracy deployment without understanding Iraq. And you can't understand Iraq without understanding previous deployments to Cambodia, Mozambique, the Golan Heights, and so on. This is the way I would see it. One can interpret it as a sort of slippery slope back to militarism. I don't think that's the case. But I think the way to understand it is a very cumulative process where each stage forms a set of preconditions for the next stage. That's the way I would understand it, at least.
Okay. Well, yes, I'm Walter Avalos. I'm a student here at Temple University. I just had a quick question in regards to the comments, mostly as part of this question. You mentioned in your slides about the public consensus and how what a thin line it was, 49 to 51, after the deployments to Zimbabwe of peacekeeping, and then after Iraq and the other piracy. And now we have, I think we can see it here in this very classroom, the relationship where we have Japanese people who wanted the military to expand, be more modern, and I guess a byproduct of that would be, like, let's say, a mother with kids who are going to the military now, and now it's getting really serious, almost like the American population, right? Very serious about this. Sounds normal. So where does the populace stand now? I'm sure just Asahi Shimbun takes polls about that. Where does it stand? Is it still a very thin line? And is there a possibility for the percentage of the public to rise towards more military or less military?
The long-term trajectory, and Andrew, please correct me, the long-term trajectory is towards more support for the military. There are ups and downs depending on, that's the long-term trajectory. I think it will continue going that way.
Like for what kind of activities is I think a really important point. So, you know, whether it's the kind of bridge building and water purifying and helping people in natural disasters, or it's actually playing more of an armed role in Afghanistan or Iraq. That I think is really the critical.
The fact that a majority were satisfied with the deployment to Iraq, the way I see it, creates the possibility for a more serious deployment in the future. That's the way I would look at it. It's not suddenly that everybody supports, you know, jets flying over to Russia and taking over Los Angeles or whatever. Of course, that's a caricature, but this is the way to understand it. Suddenly, there was a huge, the way I see it, there was a lot of anxiety and worry about the deployment to Iraq, political and general in the public. Once that was a success, that's already a precedent for the next stage. That's when we
Let me follow up on your taking advantage of co-chair sharing this.
Yeah, sure.
On your question. One could argue, of course, that there was satisfaction about Iraq because nothing happened. And I mean, after all, what is amazing in this deployment is that the Japanese government asked the coalition to provide bodyguards, namely the Australian and Netherlands military were there to protect them. And I think in the history of coalition, I mean, everybody knows coalition warfare is complex. But I think in the history of coalition warfare, this is a unique example of someone saying, I will help you fight, but by the way, can you make sure that I get protected? Because if you think of it from a purely military point of view, of course Clausewitz tells us that's not how we should think, it diminished the power of the coalition, because the Australians and the Dutch soldiers who could have been fighting the insurgency, instead had to be taken away from the front lines to make sure that nothing would happen to the Japanese, well, not soldiers, to the special civil servants who live in Iran. I like to compare them with European militaries. So obviously it makes more sense than with the Israeli military. The geopolitics is very different. Most of the European militaries have crossed the threshold of going into killing people. Not all of them, but maybe the Bundeswehr did in Afghanistan and getting killed. I assume the Norwegian special forces have also done that. I mean,
and they've had casualties.
You know, they've had casualties and they've killed people. What we've never had, you know, there's been a lot of focus of how Japan would react to Japanese special civil servants being killed. But my question is, how would Japanese react to Japanese killing people? Especially that once you go into killing, you know, you make mistakes. I mean, as Don Rumsfeld said, stuff happens in war. You mean to kill an insurgent and bingo, you know, you hit a score. That was actually a big thing in Germany after the Kunduz business. So do you see in this part, are we in a situation where we're coming closer to doing things but we still refuse to cross that line? Or do you see it, of course it's always difficult to make predictions about the future, do you see this moving to at one point saying, yes, you know, we're going to go into, well, Afghanistan is probably over, but the next time we're going to send forces to go out and kill the bad guys and behave like the others?
The argument we're having now is exactly the argument that took place in Germany before they sent their forces abroad. The German public will go bananas if a German is killed. The German public will lose all support if a Germans kill others. And I'm taking Germany, I'm not taking Norway and others, because it's the closest case to the Japanese case. This did not eventuate. This did not eventuate. And based on the comparative case of Germany, my guess is that it will be a similar thing in Japan. With, again, but I would say that it's a precondition. First of all will be the crisis of Japanese soldiers getting killed. Only later will there be a debate about them killing others. Okay? So if Japanese soldiers are killed and support will continue to be there, it'll be much easier for them to kill in the next deployment. That's the way I would see it. Canadians don't agree with my thesis, but...
I was just thinking of the time when the Japanese, before the DPJ brought back the refueling mission, the LDP had to bring back the whole refueling mission because they filled up the wrong ship. Remember? They filled up the Pakistani ship that was fighting over in Iraq as opposed to Afghanistan or vice versa. And they brought the whole shebang back and they reintroduced the law and they got that out, right? I mean, the country that does that, it folds the first time somebody gets killed. That's what is sort of shaking my head. What was that time, I suppose? Hopefully not.
We have a question in the back.
Case of Germany.
In the back, yes?
Yeah, it's Asakai, Musashi University. Your 5 categories relating to normalization I find very interesting. Although I would have thought that those categories or your definition of normalization is more belonging to public acceptance of the military. My question is, isn't there a larger question which was being discussed against public acceptance of the military to do what? Okay, certain missions in Iraq, ostensibly humanitarian, that's acceptable, more or less. But the other missions, I think there's going to be a qualitative difference. Was there any real debate during the Senkaku incident, for example? Did anybody say that Zietai should be out there protecting Japanese territory, which is more closer to home than participating in a UN mission? There wasn't an active discussion of that a couple of years ago. So I feel that, again, there's another huge jump participating in a military UN mission and participating in a legitimate, normal military action to defend Japan. So I would have thought your concept of normalization is, as I said, public acceptance, similar to public acceptance of the military in Sweden, but acceptance of military missions, I think, still is not, well, for lack of a better word, not normal.
I would agree, but I will try to answer you. In my work on the Israeli military, I found that there's an informal hierarchy among units, among soldiers, and in terms of public perceptions, in terms of the nearness of a soldier or a unit to violence. The closer you are to violence, the higher the status. Okay, this is rather obvious. But there are at least two other elements. You can be close to violence and have high status. If violence is used on you, your status goes up even more. If you are allowed to use, not necessarily use, but if you're allowed to use violence against others, those are the highest, that's the highest status, the combat arms, and not the close combat support or whatever it's called in English. And I would say that it's the same, this is what is happening here. The deployment to Iraq, of course it's not a military mission like the ones that America carried out, or Germany carried out, or Norway and so on. But it's a nearness to violence which was unthinkable before. Unthinkable. Think of it. It was something which you could not even take into account. If I were to say somebody here in Japan, pro-military, even 10 years ago or 15 years ago about this possibility, it would not have been, it would have been something which was not accepted. And that is my point. There's a greater and greater nearness to violence. And that is what I see as significant.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. Again, you may have covered in the presentation, but it was related to what is militarization. And I think this relationship of what commonly people confuse normalization, the concept of normalization, varying concepts, together with concepts of militarization. And I think it's also interesting to look at militarization and to look at what is being militarized. Is the society being militarized? Is the military being militarized? Which is another concept, concept within concept. And is policy being militarized? Brings back to the issue of what is the best defense against the militarization. And I would suggest two things. The first one is George W. Bush and Tony Blair together. And the next one is the Lehman Brothers. Right? Because militarization needs money. And the Lehman shock, if you look at the British military and how it's been hollowed out due to financial cuts, due to essentially the backwash of the Lehman shock, that's a big check on militarization. And the fact that Japanese budget's been going down since '98 is another break on any potential militarization. But I think George W. Bush and Tony Blair, the way that they militarized their foreign policies, and I don't just mean Iraq, the way they gradually increased the militarization of their policies is something that I hope doesn't happen in Japan, and I can't really imagine it. And therefore, the question of militarization has at least three different aspects, and I'm sure that
The point is very well taken, and I will have to think more of it. I thought more in terms of policy in the military, but there's also the public. Very well taken. I hope to use that differentiation.
Good. Well, we've reached our appointed hour. If you want to make a few final comments?
Myself?
Yes.
No, just thank you very much. And I've learned a lot from the